used to believe that betrayal announces itself, that it arrives loud, with slammed doors and shouted names, with something you can point to and say, "There." That was the moment everything broke. I was wrong. Betrayal, in my experience, arrives quietly. It arrives in a hospital hallway that smells like antiseptic and bad coffee, delivered by a nurse who is only trying to be kind. It arrives in a single sentence, spoken low enough that no one else can hear it. "Your husband's other visitor just left." I want to tell you that I gasped, that my knees buckled, that I had to grab the wall to stay upright. But that's not what happened. What happened is that I nodded, calmly, the way you nod when someone tells you the elevator is out of service. I said, "Oh," and I kept my voice even, because 12 years of being underestimated teaches you how to keep your voice even. Inside, though, something had already started to shift. Quietly, like a foundation settling before the first crack shows in the wall. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I was 34 years old, married for 9 years, mother to a 6-year-old girl named Sophie, and up until 3 weeks before that hallway conversation, I would have told you, without hesitation, without a flicker of doubt, that my husband Daniel was the most predictable man I had ever known. That was supposed to be a compliment. In marriage, predictability is not boring. Predictability is safety. I knew what side of the bed he slept on, how he took his coffee, which drawer he kept his watch in. I knew the sound of his car pulling into the driveway before he'd even turned off the engine. I knew, or thought I knew, the shape of his heart. We met in our 20s, at a mutual friend's engagement party, back when I still believed that the right person would simply announce themselves, the way weather does. Daniel didn't announce himself. He crept in slowly, over months of coffee dates and long phone calls, until one day I looked up and realized I couldn't picture my life without him in it. He proposed on a Tuesday, which he thought was funny. "Nobody proposes on a Tuesday," he said. "That's how you know I mean it." And I said yes before he'd even fully gotten the box open. For years, our life together was unremarkable in the best possible way. He worked in project management for his father-in-law's construction and development company. My father's company, technically, though Daniel had built his own reputation there over a decade, separate from any nepotism, or so I believed. I taught 2nd grade. We had a modest house with a crooked mailbox Daniel kept meaning to fix, a golden retriever named Biscuit, and Sunday mornings that involved pancakes and cartoons, and absolutely nothing dramatic. I remember, in particular, a trip we took for our 5th anniversary, a modest week at a rented cabin near a lake 3 hours from home. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would make for an impressive photo album. Daniel spent an entire afternoon trying, badly, to teach me how to fish, laughing every time I flinched at the worm on the hook. And that night, sitting on the dock with our feet in the cold water, he told me he couldn't imagine what his life would have looked like if he hadn't gone to that engagement party all those years earlier. "I used to think I was pretty good at reading people," he said that night. "And then I met you, and I realized I'd just never met anyone worth reading that closely before." I think about that sentence often now, turning it over the way you turn over a coin looking for the mint mark, trying to decide whether it was true when he said it, or whether some part of him even then understood how carefully he would one day need me not to read him at all. We built our whole life on the foundation of that particular kind of trust, the kind where you stop double-checking each other, where you let the small logistics of a shared existence blur together without needing to keep separate ledgers. I signed whatever he put in front of me at tax time without reading every line, because why would I need to? He deferred to me on Sophie's school decisions, on our social calendar, on the 100 small choices that make up a household, without needing to weigh in on every one, because why would he need to? That is what trust is supposed to look like. I didn't yet understand that it can also be the exact shape a lie needs in order to fit undetected into a marriage for years. I tell you all of this not because it's relevant to the plot, but because I want you to understand what it felt like to lose it. You cannot understand the size of a hole unless you understand the size of what used to fill it. The accident happened on a Thursday in early spring. Daniel was driving home from a site visit when another car ran a red light and clipped the front of his truck, sending him into a guardrail. He was lucky, the doctors said. A broken femur, 3 fractured ribs, a mild concussion. It could have been so much worse. I remember standing in the emergency room, my hands shaking as I filled out insurance paperwork, thinking that this was the worst thing that could happen to us. I remember thinking, with a kind of naive gratitude, that at least he was alive. At least I still had him. I want you to hold on to that thought because it's going to come back around later, twisted into something almost unrecognizable. For the first week, I was at the hospital every single day. I brought Sophie's drawings to tape to the wall beside his bed. I brought him the crossword puzzles he liked, the ones from the newspaper he insisted on still having delivered, even though everyone else had switched to their phones. I sat in the vinyl chair beside his bed and held his hand and told him it was going to be okay. And I believed it, because why wouldn't I? The small things started so small that I didn't even register them as things. The first was flowers. A bouquet of white lilies on the little rolling table beside his bed, the kind of arrangement that comes from an actual florist rather than a grocery store bucket. I asked him who sent them. Work, he said, not looking up from the television. Marcus probably. Or someone from the office. I didn't think anything of it. People send flowers. That's a normal thing that happens to men in hospital beds. I moved the vase 2 inches to the left so it wouldn't block the window, and I didn't think about it again for 3 days. The second thing was smaller still. So small I actually laughed about it later, in the dark, alone, the kind of laugh that isn't really a laugh at all. It was a scent. Not his cologne, not mine, not the hospital's chemical cleanliness. Something floral and expensive, clinging faintly to the collar of the hospital gown when I helped him change it. I remember pausing, my hand still on the fabric, and thinking, that's strange, and then thinking, it's probably the nurse's hand lotion, and letting it go. You always let it go, at first. That's the thing nobody tells you about the beginning of finding out. You are your own first line of defense against the truth, because the alternative, believing it, is so much harder than dismissing it. The third thing was a receipt. It fell out of his jacket pocket when I was gathering his things to take home for laundering. A small crumpled slip from the hospital cafeteria. Printed timestamp reading 2:14 p.m. on a day I had visited at 11 and left at 1, needing to pick Sophie up from school. 2 coffees. 2 blueberry muffins. I stood in the hospital parking lot holding that receipt for a long time. Who else visited you yesterday afternoon? I asked him that evening, keeping my tone light, almost playful, the way you ask a question you don't actually expect to matter. Nobody, he said. Just resting. You didn't order 2 coffees? He looked at me then, just for half a second, something flickering behind his eyes before he smoothed it over with a smile. One of the nurses brought me an extra one. I guess she charged it to my room by mistake. He shrugged. Hospital billing is a mess. It was a good answer. It was almost a perfect answer. And if it had been the only strange thing, I would have believed it completely and moved on with my life, the way I had moved on from the flowers, the way I had moved on from the perfume that wasn't mine. But I want to be honest with you about something. I am, by nature, a careful person. I balance my checkbook. I keep receipts. I notice when a picture frame is a centimeter off-center on the wall. My mother used to tease me that I would have made an excellent detective in another life. And I used to laugh it off, thinking it was just a quirk, a harmless peculiarity of my personality. I didn't know yet that it was about to become the only thing standing between me and total ruin. The fourth thing was his phone. He had always been open with it, or at least I had always assumed so. He left it face up on the kitchen counter, let me answer it when his hands were full, never flinched when I glanced at a text notification lighting up the screen. But in the hospital, something changed. I noticed it first on a Tuesday, when I walked in mid-afternoon and he startled, actually startled, at the sound of the door opening, his thumb moving fast across the screen before he set the phone face down on the blanket beside him. Sorry, he said, laughing a little too quickly. Didn't hear you come in. Everything okay? Work stuff. Boring. I let it go, because that is what you do in the beginning. You let it go, and you tell yourself you are being generous, understanding, the kind of wife who doesn't interrogate her husband over a flinch. But I noticed, in the days that followed, that the flinch had become a pattern. He kept the phone closer to his body. He started taking calls in the hallway, murmuring, one hand cupped around his mouth like a man trying not to be overheard in a room with no one else in it. The fifth thing was smaller, almost embarrassingly so. And yet it was the one that kept me awake the longest. I was helping him into a clean shirt. His left arm was still stiff from the seatbelt bruising, and dressing himself one-handed exhausted him, when I noticed a faint mark just above his collarbone. Not a bruise from the accident. A small, deliberate-looking indentation, the kind of fingernail leaves when pressed briefly and hard into skin. "What's this from?" I asked, running my thumb over it. "No idea," he said. "Probably the seatbelt. Or a nurse moving me for x-rays." It was a reasonable answer. Hospitals are full of hands moving you roughly, quickly, without ceremony. I told myself that, and mostly I believed it. But some small, cold part of me, the part that keeps receipts, the part that notices crooked picture frames, filed it away anyway, the way you file away a word in a language you're only just beginning to learn, not yet sure if you'll ever need it, but unwilling to let it go entirely. The sixth thing, the one that finally cracked something open in me, wasn't a thing at all. It was an absence. I had gone to refill his water pitcher, and passed the small whiteboard by the door where the nursing staff logged his vitals and his care team. Beneath the handwriting listing his nurse's name and the day's date, there was a line I hadn't paid attention to before. "Visitors today." Someone had written, in blue dry erase marker, a single set of initials. MC 1:40 p.m. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at two letters that meant nothing to me and everything, somehow, all at once. I didn't know anyone with those initials. Not a coworker, not a cousin, not a single name from the guest list of our own wedding 9 years earlier. I wiped the board clean myself before I left that day. The way you might scrub a stain out of a shirt before anyone else notices it's there, though I couldn't have told you, if you'd asked me in that moment, exactly what I was trying to protect myself from seeing again. It was 4 days later when the nurse pulled me aside. I had come in during my lunch break, a habit I'd developed over the 3 weeks of his hospitalization. A quick 30 minutes between the end of my morning classes and the start of recess duty, just enough time to check on him, kiss his forehead, tell him Sophie missed him. I was walking toward his room when a nurse named Patricia, a kind-faced woman in her 50s who had been caring for him since the first night, touched my arm gently in the hallway. "Can I talk to you for a second?" she asked, and something in her voice made me stop walking. We stepped a few feet away from his door, close enough to the nurse's station that I could hear the low beeping of monitors from other rooms, other people's small emergencies. "I don't want to overstep," she said. "But I thought you should know. Your husband's other visitor just left." I remember the exact texture of that moment. The fluorescent lights overhead. The squeak of someone's shoes on the linoleum somewhere down the hall. The way Patricia's eyes held mine, careful, apologetic. The way you look at someone when you're about to hand them something heavy. "I'm sorry," I said. "His other visitor?" "A woman," Patricia said. "She's been coming by most afternoons this week. I just assumed you knew. I wouldn't normally say anything, but she seemed. I don't know. It felt off to me. I thought you'd want to know." I want to tell you I asked a dozen urgent questions right there in the hallway. I didn't. I have replayed this moment more times than I can count. And every time, I am struck by how calm I sounded, how measured, as if some other version of me had stepped forward to handle the conversation while the real me stood frozen somewhere behind my own eyes. "What does she look like?" I asked. "Younger than you, I'd guess. Maybe late 20s. Dark hair, always in a blazer, like she's coming from an office. Carries a leather bag, not a purse, more like a briefcase. She doesn't stay long. 20 minutes, maybe. And she doesn't." Patricia hesitated. "Doesn't what?" "She doesn't act like the visitors I usually see in this situation. She's not affectionate with him. No hand-holding, nothing like that. If anything, she seems all business." "But your husband?" Patricia paused again, choosing her words with visible care. "He gets agitated after she leaves. Anxious. Once he asked me not to let his blood pressure numbers show on the monitor when she was in the room, which, that's not really something I can do, but it struck me as odd. I thanked her. I actually thanked her. The way you thank someone for holding a door. Some reflexive politeness rising up out of the wreckage of everything I thought I understood about my own life. Then I walked into Daniel's room, and I smiled at him, and I asked how he was feeling, and I did not mention a single word of what I had just learned. This is the part of the story I think about most when people ask me how I got through it. Because everyone expects the confrontation. Everyone wants the moment where I slam my hand on the hospital tray table and demand to know who she is. That moment never came. Not that day. Not for a long time. I chose instead to watch. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. Watching is not weakness. Watching is not the same as denial. There is a particular kind of strength in choosing to gather the truth on your own terms, rather than handing your reaction to someone else on theirs. Daniel had built whatever this was carefully, in the spaces where I wasn't looking. I decided I would learn about it the same way, carefully, in the spaces where he wasn't looking. That night, after Sophie was asleep and the house was quiet except for the hum of the dishwasher, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and opened our joint bank account. I hadn't looked closely at our finances in months. That was my first mistake, and I want to say that plainly, because I think a lot of women make it. Daniel had always handled the numbers, as he called them. He had an MBA, he understood spreadsheets in a way that made my eyes glaze over. And somewhere along the way I had quietly ceded that entire portion of our life to him. The way you cede the thermostat to whoever complains about the temperature more. The checking account looked normal. Groceries, the mortgage, Sophie's dance class, the usual river of small transactions that make up an ordinary life. But when I clicked over to the savings account, the one we'd been building for years toward a kitchen renovation we kept postponing, I noticed the balance was lower than I remembered. $22,000 lower. I sat very still, staring at the number, running through every reasonable explanation I could think of. Had we discussed a transfer? Had he mentioned an investment? Nothing came to mind, but I told myself that didn't mean anything. Maybe I'd simply forgotten a conversation. Marriages are full of half-remembered logistics. I clicked into the transaction history, and there it was, a wire transfer, made 6 weeks earlier, to an account I didn't recognize. No memo. No explanation. Just a string of numbers and a dollar amount that used to represent a kitchen full of new cabinets, and was now representing something I couldn't yet name. I did not confront him about it the next day. I want you to understand how hard that was. How every instinct in me wanted to march into that hospital room and demand answers. But some quieter, colder part of me understood that if I showed my hand too early, he would have time to build an explanation sturdy enough to survive it. I had learned over one hallway conversation and one bank statement that my husband was capable of hiding things from me skillfully. I needed to know how much before I let him know that I knew anything at all. So I became, for lack of a better word, an investigator in my own marriage. I started small. I asked our next-door neighbor, an older woman named Carol who had lived on our street for 20 years and noticed everything, whether she'd seen anyone unfamiliar around the house in the past few months. Actually, Carol said, watering the small patch of tomatoes she grew every summer, there was a car I didn't recognize, parked out front a few times back in the winter. Dag sedan. I only noticed because it was there so late, like after 10 at night. I figured maybe it was one of Daniel's work friends. Late at night, while I had been asleep upstairs, presumably, or perhaps working a late parent-teacher conference, or simply not paying attention to what happened in front of my own house after dark. I thanked Carol and went back inside and sat with that information the way you sit with a bruise, pressing on it slightly just to feel how deep it goes. The next piece came from an unlikely source. Our shared family calendar app, the one Daniel and I used to coordinate school pickups and work schedules. I had never had a reason to scrutinize it before, but now I scrolled back through months of entries, looking for anything unusual. Most of it was mundane: dentist appointments, Sophie's soccer games, his work trips. But there, scattered across 4 months, were 6 entries labeled simply meeting MC. No location. No further notes. They didn't correspond to anything in his usual client roster that I knew of, and the timing of them, always early evening, always lasting exactly 90 minutes, felt oddly rigid for something as loose and unpredictable as most business meetings tend to be. I didn't know who MC was. Not yet. There is a particular discipline required to investigate someone you sleep beside every night, and I had to teach it to myself as I went, learning the rules through trial and error. The way you learn any new skill you never wanted to need. Rule 1, I decided, was patience. I could not ask a single question that would tip my hand before I understood the full shape of what I was looking at. So instead of asking Daniel who MC was, I began, quietly, to build a picture of his days without him. I started keeping a small notebook, not on my phone, where he might see a notification or stumble across an open app, but an actual paper notebook, the kind Sophie used for her spelling homework, tucked at the bottom of a tote bag I only used for grocery runs. Every evening, after he'd fallen asleep, I wrote down anything from that day that didn't sit right. A word he'd used oddly, a time discrepancy in something he'd told me, the name of a restaurant on a delivery app notification I happened to see light up his screen. One he claimed was team lunch, even though it arrived, according to the receipt still glowing on the lock screen, at 6:45 in the evening. I called the cafeteria at the hospital directly on a pretense. I told the woman who answered that I was trying to reconcile a billing discrepancy from my husband's stay, which wasn't technically a lie, and asked whether they kept records of which room orders were charged to. She said they didn't track by name, only by room number and time, but she pulled up the log for me anyway, reading off timestamps in a bored, obliging voice. 2 coffees and 2 muffins charged to his room, at 2:14 p.m. on a Wednesday. 2 coffees again the following Monday, at 1:50 p.m. A turkey sandwich split, her word split, because the order notation apparently specified cut in half 2 plates, the Thursday after that. Every single one of those timestamps fell in the narrow window between my lunchtime visit and Sophie's school pickup. The window where I wasn't there. The window Daniel had, whether consciously or not, learned to keep empty of me and full of someone else. I began very carefully to test that window. One Thursday, instead of leaving after my usual 30-minute visit, I told Daniel I had a doctor's appointment of my own to get to, kissed his forehead, and walked out toward the parking garage as if I were leaving for the day. Then I doubled back. I sat in my car in the far corner of the hospital's visitor lot, low in my seat, watching the main entrance the way I imagine actual private investigators do it, though I felt more foolish than professional, gripping a paper coffee cup I'd bought simply to have something to hold. At 1:52 p.m., a woman walked out of the sliding glass doors. Dark hair, pulled back neatly, a navy blazer despite the warm spring afternoon, a leather bag over one shoulder, structured and boxy, exactly as Patricia had described it. Not a purse, something closer to a briefcase. She didn't look distraught or furtive, or like a woman leaving the bedside of a lover. She looked, if anything, brisk, businesslike. She checked her phone once, unlocked a gray sedan, and pulled out of the lot without a backward glance at the building behind her. I did not follow her. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story where I would have, where the drama of the moment would have demanded it, tires screeching, some reckless chase down city streets. I didn't do that. I sat in my car instead, and I wrote down the make and color of her sedan, and the first 3 letters of her license plate, which was as much as I could make out from that distance, and I drove home to relieve the babysitter, and I did not say a single word to Daniel that night about what I'd seen. I want to pause here and tell you something that I think is important, especially for anyone listening to this who might be standing exactly where I was standing. There is a particular kind of loneliness in investigating your own life. You cannot ask your closest friends for help without eventually having to say the words out loud. I think my husband is hiding something, and once you say those words, you can't take them back. You cannot unring that bell. So for a long time, it was just me and my laptop, and my carefully organized folder of screenshots, growing quietly on a desktop icon labeled, with grim humor, Home Repairs. I did, eventually, tell one person, my best friend since college, a woman named Priya who had been the maid of honor at my wedding and who had on that day, made a toast about Daniel's steadiness, his reliability, the very qualities I had built my entire sense of safety around. I called her on a Sunday afternoon while Daniel napped upstairs, sitting on the back porch step with biscuits, head resting heavy on my knee, and I told her everything I'd found so far, the flowers, the perfume, the receipt, the wire transfer. Priya was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Do you think it's an affair? She finally asked. I don't know what I think, I said, and I remember how strange those words felt in my mouth, because I had always been a person with opinions, A person who knew what she thought. None of it fits together the way an affair would. If he wanted to hide a woman from me, why would there be loan paperwork? Why would there be a lien from some company I've never heard of? Maybe it's both, Priya said quietly. Maybe it's more than one thing. I didn't want to believe that. I think some part of me was still hoping, foolishly, for the simpler betrayal. An affair I could grieve cleanly, name plainly, and decisively. An affair has a shape everyone recognizes. What I was looking at didn't have a shape yet at all. Don't confront him, Priya said before we hung up. Not yet. Get everything first. Once you say it out loud to him, you can't take it back, and if this is bigger than we think, you're going to need proof, not just suspicion. It was the same instinct I'd already been following on my own, but hearing it from someone else, someone outside my own increasingly disorienting head, steadied me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. I went back inside that evening, kissed my sleeping husband's forehead the way I had every night for 9 years, and went back to the kitchen table to keep digging. Daniel was discharged from the hospital 11 days after the accident, his leg in a cast, moving around the house on crutches with the kind of irritable helplessness that afflicts formerly independent men. I took 2 weeks off work to help him. I brought him meals on trays. I helped him shower. I did all the quiet, unglamorous labor of caregiving, and every night, after he'd fallen asleep with the television murmuring low in the background, I went back to my laptop. It was during this period that I found the loan documents. I hadn't been looking for them specifically. I had been searching for something else entirely, trying to identify the mystery wire transfer by digging through old emails, hoping to find some receipt or confirmation that might explain it. When I stumbled across a folder in Daniel's email, buried 3 layers deep, labeled with a generic name that gave nothing away. Q2 notes. Inside were PDF attachments from a title company, home equity loan paperwork, a loan against our house, our actual house, the one with the crooked mailbox and the tomato plants next door, for $85,000. I stared at the number for a long time before I made myself scroll down to the signature page. There, beside Daniel's signature, was mine. Except I had never signed it. I want you to understand what that felt like, because I don't think there's an adequate word for it in English. It wasn't just fear, though fear was there. It wasn't just anger, though anger was there too, simmering somewhere beneath the surface, patient, waiting its turn. It was something closer to vertigo. The sudden, sickening realization that the ground you thought was solid had actually been hollow the whole time, and you simply hadn't fallen through it yet. My signature. Forged. On a legal document. Against our house. I sat at that kitchen table until nearly 3 in the morning, and I did not cry. I want to say that clearly, because I think people expect tears at this point in the story, and I understand why. But what I felt in that moment wasn't the kind of grief that produces tears. It was colder than that. It was the feeling of a door quietly closing on one version of my life, and another door, one I hadn't known existed, creaking open somewhere in the dark. I made myself do one more thing before I allowed myself to go to bed. I pulled out an old birthday card Daniel had given me years earlier, one I still kept in the drawer of my nightstand for reasons I couldn't fully explain even to myself, and I laid it flat beside the printed signature page from the loan document, comparing the two side by side under the kitchen light. My real signature slants slightly to the left, a habit left over from being taught cursive by a left-handed aunt as a child. The signature on the loan document didn't slant at all. It was close. Close enough that a bank teller glancing at it during a routine closing would never have questioned it. But it wasn't mine. Someone had studied my handwriting carefully enough to approximate it, but not carefully enough to fool me. I thought about all the birthday cards, all the grocery lists, all the notes I'd left on the refrigerator over 9 years of marriage, unknowingly providing a template for my own forgery. It is a strange, specific kind of violation, discovering that the private, unremarkable evidence of your own handwriting, the shopping lists, the sticky notes, the back by 6, love you scrawled on the counter, has been studied and copied by the person who claimed to know you best. I called the title company first thing the next morning, before Daniel was even awake, using the excuse that I was trying to locate a copy of paperwork for our own records. The woman on the phone was helpful, unbothered, entirely unaware of what she was confirming for me. Yes, she said, both signatures had been notarized in person, at a satellite office 2 towns over, one neither of us had ever used for anything else in our married life. Yes, both parties had presented photo identification at the time of signing. I had never once in my entire life been to that satellite office. I had never presented identification for a loan I never knew existed. Someone else had stood in my place that day, close enough to my own handwriting and my own name to satisfy a notary, who had no reason to look any harder than she did. By the time the sun came up, I had made a decision. I was not going to confront Daniel yet. Not until I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. A forged signature on a loan document was not an affair. It was something else. Something with a name I didn't want to say out loud yet, because saying it would make it real, and I needed, for just a little while longer, to keep operating in the space before real. I called in sick to work the next day, the first time I had done that in almost 4 years, and I drove to the county recorder's office. There were 3. The first was the original mortgage, filed when we bought the house 6 years earlier. That one I recognized, that one. The second was the $85,000 home equity loan I had already found in his email, dated 6 weeks before his accident. The third stopped my breath entirely. It was a lien, filed by a company called Ridgeline Capital Partners, dated just 4 months earlier, for a debt of $140,000. I had never heard of Ridgeline Capital Partners in my life. I sat in my car in the recorder's office parking lot for almost an hour, the documents spread across my passenger seat, trying to make the numbers add up into something that made sense. $85,000 from the equity loan. $140,000 lien from a company I'd never encountered. The $22,000 wire transfer from our savings. None of it fit the life I thought we were living. The modest teacher's salary, the project manager's salary, the crooked mailbox, the postponed kitchen renovation. Where had all that money gone? And more importantly, who was MC, and what did she have to do with any of it? I want to tell you about the moment I finally learned who she was, because it did not come the way I expected. I had imagined, in the weeks leading up to it, that I would eventually hire a private investigator, someone with a long lens camera and a folder full of glossy photographs, the way it happens in movies. What actually happened was much simpler, and much stranger. I called my cousin Renata, who works as a paralegal at a mid-sized law firm downtown, under the pretense of asking a general legal question about home equity loans. Renata is sharp, sharper than most lawyers I've met, honestly, and she picked up on the tension in my voice almost immediately. "You're not asking me this hypothetically," she said. "What's going on?" I told her everything. Not all at once. It spilled out of me in pieces, the way water finds its way through cracks, but by the end of the phone call, Renata had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of someone doing calculations in their head. "Ridgeline Capital Partners," she said finally. "Can you send me the lien document?" I did, that same night. She called me back less than an hour later, and her voice had changed. It had the careful, measured tone of someone delivering news she knows will land hard. "I looked into this," she said. "Ridgeline isn't a normal lender. They're a specialty firm. They buy distressed debt, and they also do forensic financial recovery work. Basically, companies hire them when they suspect internal theft and want to trace where the money went before they go to the police or file a civil suit." "I don't understand," I said, though some part of me, some cold, clear-eyed part, was already beginning to. "Renee," she said, using my name for the first time in the whole conversation. The way people do when they're about to say something they wish they didn't have to. "I think your husband might be under investigation." The world did not stop. I want to be honest about that too, because in the stories we tell ourselves, in the version of this that plays out in movies, there's always a dramatic freeze-frame moment. There wasn't one for me. There was just Renata's voice on the phone, and the sound of Sophie's cartoons playing faintly from the living room, and my own hand, steady, writing down everything Renata said on the back of an envelope from the electric company. Over the next several days, working together, Renata using resources at her firm, me using every piece of documentation I had already gathered, we began to assemble something that looked less like an affair and more like an unraveling. Daniel had been working for the past 2 years, As the project manager overseeing 3 mid-sized development sites for my father's company, he had authority to approve vendor invoices up to a certain threshold without additional sign-off. A threshold that had been raised, at his own request, 18 months earlier, because he'd argued it would streamline operations and speed up construction timelines. What Renata's contact discovered, and later what came out in full during the investigation, was that Daniel had created 2 shell vendor companies, paper entities that existed only on invoices, with no actual employees, no actual work performed. Over the course of nearly 2 years, he had approved and processed payments to these fake vendors totaling just over $300,000, funneling the money into personal accounts before slowly, carefully, moving it through several intermediary transfers designed to make it harder to trace back to him. The woman in the blazer, the one with the leather bag, the one Patricia the nurse had described as all business, no affection, was not his mistress. Her name was Marguerite Cho. She was a forensic financial investigator, hired 6 months earlier by my father's company after an internal audit flagged irregularities in vendor payments across Daniel's projects. She had been quietly building a case against him for months. The hospital visits, the ones that made him anxious enough to ask a nurse to hide his blood pressure readings, were not tender check-ins from a secret lover. They were interviews. Interrogations, almost conducted with careful legal precision, designed to see what he would say, what he would admit, whether he understood yet how much they already knew. The accident, the guardrail, the broken femur, the 3 fractured ribs, had happened 4 days after Marguerite first contacted him directly to request an in-person meeting about discrepancies in Q1 vendor documentation. I have never been able to prove, and I don't know that anyone ever will, whether the crash was truly an accident, or whether some part of my husband, cornered and panicking, made a choice behind the wheel of that truck that he never intended to survive. I don't say this to be dramatic. I say it because it is a question I have had to learn to live beside, unanswered, the way you learn to live beside a locked door in a house you otherwise know completely. The $22,000 wire transfer from our savings had gone toward a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer, as I had briefly, foolishly hoped when Renata first suggested it, but a criminal defense attorney, retained the same week Marguerite's audit findings were first presented to my father's board. The $85,000 home equity loan, the one bearing my forged signature, had been used to begin repaying the embezzled funds quietly, in an attempt to make the discrepancy disappear from the books before a formal criminal referral could be made. A last, desperate act of financial sleight of hand, using our family home, and my name, without my knowledge or consent. And the lien from Ridgeline Capital Partners, the $140,000 I hadn't been able to account for, turned out to be the remaining balance of what Daniel owed back to the company, now formally documented, now attached to our property, now very much my problem too, regardless of whether I had known anything about any of it. I remember sitting across the kitchen table from Daniel 3 weeks after Patricia first pulled me aside in that hospital hallway. His leg was still in the cast. Sophie was at my mother's house for the night, a fact I had arranged deliberately, because some part of me had known, even before I fully understood what I was about to say, that this was not a conversation for our daughter to be anywhere near. I laid the documents out on the table between us, one at a time, the way you might lay out cards in a losing hand, except this time I was the one holding all the cards, and he was the one about to lose everything. "Who is MC?" I asked him first, watching his face carefully. He went very pale. "Renee." "Who is she, Daniel?" "It's not what you think," he said, and I remember almost laughing, because of course that's what he said, because that is what they always say, as if there is some universal script handed out to unfaithful husbands and embezzling project managers alike, as if the specific details of the betrayal don't matter as much as the desperate, predictable shape of the denial. "I know exactly what it is," I said. "I have the loan documents. I have the lien. I have the wire transfer records. I know about the shell companies, Daniel. I know about Ridgeline. I know Marguerite Cho isn't your girlfriend. She's the forensic investigator my father's company hired to find out how you stole $300,000 from them." I watched something collapse behind his eyes. Not shock. He knew somewhere in that moment that whatever he'd been building to protect himself had finally, completely failed. It was something closer to relief, honestly, the particular relief of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and has just been told he doesn't have to carry it alone anymore, even if the alternative is far worse than the weight itself. I was going to fix it, he said quietly. Before it got this far. I was going to pay it back. With my signature, I said. On a loan against my house. Without asking me. I want to tell you what happened after that, because I think it matters just as much as the reveal itself, maybe more. I did not scream. I did not throw the documents at him, though God knows I wanted to. I sat there, in the kitchen where I had made him 1,000 ordinary breakfasts, and I told him, in the calmest voice I could manage, that I would be contacting a divorce attorney in the morning, and that I would also be cooperating fully with any investigation my father's company chose to pursue, regardless of what that meant for him. You'd really do that, he said. To me. You did this, I said. Not me. I'm just the one who's done pretending I didn't notice. I was trying to protect you, he said, his voice rising for the first time, cracking around the edges. If I'd told you if you'd known how bad it was, I thought I could fix it before it ever touched you. That's the only reason I didn't say anything. You put a lien on my house, I said. You forged my name on a legal document. You let me believe for weeks that you were having an affair, because the truth was apparently too heavy to hand me honestly. None of that sounds like protection to me, Daniel. It sounds like you decided on my behalf, without asking me, that I couldn't handle knowing the truth about my own life. You didn't have an answer for that. I remember the silence that followed almost more clearly than anything either of us said. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside, Biscuit's collar jingling faintly from the living room where he'd wandered off, uninterested in the gravity of what was happening in the next room. What happens now? He finally asked, quietly, and for a moment he sounded less like the man I'd built a life with and more like a boy waiting to hear how much trouble he was in. Now, I said. I stopped being the last person to know things about my own life. Marguerite Cho, it turned out, was not the villain of this story, whatever role she'd played in my early, panicked imagination. When I finally met her in person, during a deposition, of all places, both of us sitting stiffly at opposite ends of a long conference table. She was courteous, professional, almost gentle with me, in the specific way that people are gentle with someone they know has been collateral damage in someone else's crime. I'm sorry you found out about all this the way you did, she told me afterward. In the parking garage, both of us walking to our cars in a silence that felt strange rather than uncomfortable. The hospital visits weren't. I know how they must have looked. They looked like an affair, I said. I know, she said. I almost told the nurse who I was actually the first week. I could tell she was suspicious of me, but I wasn't allowed to disclose anything about an active investigation. Not even to clear my own name in the eyes of a stranger. I'm sorry that meant you had to find out the way you did. I appreciated that, oddly. Even now, I think about it. The strange kindness of a woman who had unknowingly been the catalyst for the unraveling of my entire life, taking a moment in a parking garage to acknowledge that the unraveling had cost me something real. Telling my parents was its own particular kind of reckoning. My father had known Daniel for 11 years by then. Had hired him, mentored him, stood beside him at our wedding and given a toast about how proud he was to welcome a son into the business as well as the family. I drove to their house on a Sunday afternoon, sat at the same kitchen table I'd grown up eating breakfast at, and told him what Renata and I had found. My father is not a man who raises his voice. I have seen him angry perhaps 3 times in my entire life, and this was the 4th. He didn't shout. He went very still instead, his jaw working silently for a long moment before he finally spoke. How much, he said. Not a question really. A demand for the full weight of it. Just over 300,000, before the loan and the lien, I said. More once you count what he tried to move around to cover it. My father closed his eyes. I brought him into this company because I loved you, he said. I trusted him because you did. I need you to know that none of this is your fault, Renee. Not $1 of it. I appreciated that, more than I could say at the time, because some small, unfair part of me had been carrying a quiet guilt since the moment I found the forged signature. As if I should have noticed sooner. As if 9 years of marriage should have made me somehow immune to being deceived this completely. My father's certainty helped loosen that guilt, even if it never fully let go of me. The deposition, when it finally came, was held in a downtown conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a pitcher of water no one touched. I sat across from Marguerite Cho for nearly 3 hours while attorneys from both sides walked through timelines, dollar figures, dates I had already memorized from my own notebook, my own quiet nights at the kitchen table. It was strange, hearing my private investigation recited back to me in formal legal language, stripped of the fear and grief that had accompanied every discovery the first time around. Numbers on a page. Facts finally, instead of suspicions. At one point, one of the attorneys asked Marguerite to describe her visits to the hospital in detail, dates, duration, the general content of the conversations, to establish that no privileged information had been improperly disclosed. She answered plainly, professionally, and I found myself oddly grateful for the clarity of it. There was no ambiguity left in any of it by then. No perfume I couldn't place, no receipt I had to explain away. Just a woman doing her job, and a man who had spent 2 years building something false enough to require her. The company Daniel had defrauded, my father's company, the one he'd built from nothing over 30 years, the one Daniel had worked for out of what I'd always assumed was quiet, dutiful respect for my family, ultimately decided not to pursue criminal charges, largely at my father's insistence, though I know Marguerite's report recommended otherwise. Instead, Daniel was required to sign a full confession of the embezzlement, agree to a repayment structure that would take him the better part of 15 years to complete, and resign immediately, with the understanding that any future violation would result in the criminal referral being reopened. I don't know exactly why my father chose mercy over prosecution. When I asked him, he simply said, "Because Sophie needs a father who isn't in prison, even if she doesn't need the marriage that gave her one." I think about that sentence more often than almost anything else from that entire period. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. I kept the house. Daniel's share of the equity went almost entirely towards settling the Ridgeline lien and beginning repayment of the embezzled funds, which meant I inherited a home with far less value than I'd believed I had, but a home nonetheless, one I had fought, quietly and methodically, to keep clean of his fraud. Daniel sees Sophie every other weekend. He has, to his credit, kept up with the payments, both the ones to Ridgeline and the ones to me for child support, without missing a single one, as if some part of him is trying, in the only language he has left, to prove that the man I married wasn't entirely a fiction, even if the version of him I thought I knew clearly was. I think about that hospital hallway often. Patricia, the nurse, still works at that same hospital. I ran into her once, months later, at a pharmacy of all places, and she asked me carefully, gently, how things had turned out. I told her the truth, or most of it, and she shook her head slowly. "I almost didn't say anything," she admitted. "I told myself it wasn't my business. I'm glad I did, though. I'm glad you knew before it got any worse." I am too. I think about how easily I could have dismissed that hallway conversation. The way I'd dismissed the flowers, the perfume, the receipt, small, deniable things that would have been so easy to explain away if I hadn't finally decided to stop explaining and start looking. People ask me sometimes what the lesson of all this is. As if a betrayal this size can be flattened into a single takeaway, a tidy moral you could stitch onto a pillow. I don't know that I have one clean answer. But if I had to offer something, it would be this. Pay attention to the small inconsistencies, even, especially, when the easy thing to do is dismiss them. Not because every mismatched detail hides a catastrophe, but because you deserve to know, on your own terms, in your own time, whatever truth is quietly assembling itself in the spaces you're not looking. I did not scream when Patricia pulled me aside in that hallway. I did not scream when I found the wire transfer, or the forged signature, or the lien with a company name I'd never heard of. I have wondered, sometimes, whether that composure was a strength or simply the only shape my shock knew how to take. I've come to believe it was both. Grief and vigilance can occupy the same body at the same time. I have learned to let them. There was one evening, a few months after the divorce was finalized, when Sophie asked me, out of nowhere, why Daddy didn't live with us anymore. She was 7 at the time, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, more focused on braiding her doll's hair than on the question itself. The way children ask the most enormous questions as though they were the smallest thing in the world. I had rehearsed an answer for this moment many times in my head, revising it every time I thought I'd finally landed on the right words. In the end, what I told her was simple. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt the people who love them. I said. Even when they don't mean to. Daddy made some choices that meant he couldn't live with us anymore. But none of that is because of anything you did, and none of it means he loves you any less. She considered this for a moment, still focused on the doll's hair. Did he hurt you? She asked. He made things very hard for a while. I said, choosing my words as carefully as I had chosen them in every deposition, every affidavit, every conversation with a lawyer over the preceding months. But I'm okay. We're okay. Good, she said simply, and went back to her braiding, and that, for a 7-year-old, was apparently enough. I envied her, a little, in that moment. The way a child can hold a hard truth and set it back down again without needing to turn it over and over, searching every angle of it the way I had turned over every document, every timestamp, every forged line of my own name. Sophie is 8 now. She doesn't remember much about that spring, the hospital, the crutches, the strange tension that must have hummed beneath every interaction in our house during those investigative weeks. Though children absorb more than we credit them for. And I sometimes wonder what she noticed that I never explained. I kept the crooked mailbox in the end. Daniel always meant to fix it and never did, and somewhere along the way, after everything, I decided I liked it slightly crooked. It reminds me that a thing can be imperfect, even slightly broken, and still stand exactly where it's supposed to be, holding exactly what it's supposed to hold, for as long as you're willing to keep tending to it. I never got my kitchen renovation. I got something else instead, a harder, more valuable kind of knowledge, the kind that doesn't come with granite countertops but tends to outlast them anyway. I learned that the version of strength I'd always admired in other women, the loud kind, the kind that makes for dramatic television, slammed doors and raised voices, was never actually the only kind available to me. There is another kind. The quiet kind. The kind that sits very still at a kitchen table at 3 in the morning, gathering evidence instead of gathering rage, choosing patience over panic, choosing the long, careful work of understanding over the short, satisfying release of confrontation. That is the kind of strength that got me through it. And if you are sitting somewhere right now, noticing something small and inconsistent in your own life, a receipt, a scent, a hallway conversation you can't quite shake, I hope you trust that same instinct in yourself. Because the truth, in my experience, rarely announces itself all at once. It arrives in pieces, quietly, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. I was that someone. And however much it cost me, I have never once regretted choosing to look. Sometimes, late at night, after Sophie is asleep and the house has gone quiet in that particular way it does when you're the only adult awake in it, I think about Patricia, standing in that hallway with her hand light on my arm, choosing to say something she didn't have to say. I think about how easily that moment could have gone differently. A nurse who decided it wasn't her business. A woman who walked past a strange car in a hospital parking lot without ever slowing down to look at it twice. I don't know if I believe in fate exactly, but I believe in the accumulation of small, deliberate attentions. A nurse's instinct, a neighbor's memory of a car parked too late at night, a cousin willing to make one phone call on a Sunday, a woman with a leather bag who chose, in a parking garage, to say she was sorry even though she had nothing to apologize for. None of them alone would have been enough. Together, they built the floor I eventually stood on to face what my marriage had actually been, instead of the floor I'd been quietly, unknowingly standing on for years. The one made of forged signatures and shell companies and a story he told himself was protection. I don't regret any of it now. Not the discovery, not the quiet nights of investigation, not even the marriage itself, because it gave me Sophie, and it gave me, eventually, a clearer understanding of exactly what my own strength is capable of when it isn't rushed, when it isn't shouted, when it's simply allowed to do its slow, careful work in the dark until the light finally comes up on its own.